Hi, I'm Victoria Peat, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make this really great strip of Flying Geese units using the foundation paper piecing method. I'm going to talk you through the tools that you need, how to prepare your paper pattern, and then finally how to add all these pieces of fabric to create a really beautiful, really precise strip of Flying Geese units. So in order to make these Flying Geese strips, I have got my foundation printed out. I've just used standard printer paper, but you can use specialist paper if you prefer. I have a craft knife for cutting out my template. I've got some glue pen. I have my fabrics, a rotary cutter, add a quarter ruler. I also have my add an eighth ruler, but you don't necessarily need one of those. I also have an acrylic ruler here as well, my sewing machine, my rotary mat, pressing surface, my iron, and I have a wooden clapper as well. So to start off with, I am working today on Flying Geese units in a strip, and each of the units themselves measure 4 inches by 2 inches. That means that when these are finished, this is going to be 4 inches across and 2 inches high for each of the Flying Geese units. And this strip happens to have 4 Flying Geese units in this strip. You can, of course, reduce the size of this strip or lengthen it according to your project needs. Now, before I start doing anything, I will just take my ruler and I will double check that my 1 inch test square actually does measure 1 inch. Because what I don't want to do is do all of this sewing and then realize that my finished strip isn't exactly the right width or the right length that I'm looking for. So I'm just measuring that against my acrylic ruler to make sure that that is 1 inch. If it's not, I know that I need to go back and adjust some of my printer settings. Now on this template, you'll see that there are straight solid lines and there's a dashed line. Each of these straight lines, or solid lines, sorry, are the stitching lines. And this dashed line around the outside edge is the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance that you will need around this outside edge in order to sew this to something else. So that's just what that dashed line represents. When I'm working with these templates, I will trim away all this excess paper. Now, I don't do that to the dashed line. I go slightly to the outside of the dashed line to give me the opportunity to trim up and square up my finished strip at the end. So I'm going to use my craft knife, but you can, of course, use some scissors. Or what I sometimes do is I keep my old rotary blades and I put them in a different handle and I use those purely just for paper. So it's up to you. But you can see here how I'm just roughly trimming this down to the outside of the dotted line. Okay, and then I don't need the paper, so I'll just get rid of that. Okay, now when it comes to preparing your fabrics, for Flying Geese, these are all very regular sizes. So these central sections, the geese, are all exactly the same size, and all of the triangles on the side, which are the skies, they're all exactly the same size. So when I'm doing something foundation paper piece that's very regular, I find that there is value to me in preparing my fabrics. So I have some squares pre-cut, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut each of those squares in half to give me some triangles. For the sky, when you cut the square in half, you'll get 2 triangles, and you'll use both of those in each Flying Geese unit. So I've pre-prepared several of those, but I've got one here that I'll show you, and I'm just placing my acrylic ruler on one point at one end and the point at the other to cut that in half. And that will give me 2 triangles then that I can use for the geese sections. So I've got a load of those prepared here. And for the geese sections, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to take a square and I'm going to cut that in half to give me a triangle for this geese area. Again, I'm taking my ruler, going point to point to cut that square in half. Now, if you'd like some help with working out the size of the square that you need in order to cut it in half, I've got a cheat sheet on the website that's available. Now the design that I'm working on, I've decided that I'd like each of my geese sections to be a different colour. Therefore, I'm only going to need half of the square that I've just cut in half. If you have decided, for example, you were doing this strip that has 4 Flying Geese units, you would cut 2 squares and cut them in half, and that will give you the 4. Or you might be working with 2 fabrics and you'll just cut 1 square of each to do 2 geese sections, but I've decided to do 4 because I think it's pretty. So half of these squares are going to be discarded for the time being, but I will come back to them one day, I promise. I promise. So I've got here some other squares that I just want to cut in half. So just taking my acrylic ruler, going point to point. I'm just swapping that one over. And then do this one. So now I have all of my fabrics cut out and ready to go. You need to decide which order they're going to go in, and you might want to mark up your strip with some coloured pencils or something. Just don't use anything that's heat erasable because you will be using your iron in this process. So we're going to do in order. It's sewing by numbers. So we're going to start with section number 1 here, and this triangle here is section number 1. Now your piece of fabric that you need for this is going to be the size of this exact triangle plus 1/4 inch round these outside edges. So the triangle of fabric that you've got should be big enough not to sit exactly on these straight lines, but overlapping to allow 1/4 inch around all sides. So to start off with, we flip our pattern over. And if you're working with printer paper, this is more challenging because you can't see these lines through to this side unless you're using something like a light box. So it does become more challenging. If you're using foundation paper, that's one of the great benefits, is that you can see through. But don't be discouraged from trying foundation paper piecing if you don't have that specialist paper. It's absolutely possible to do it with standard printer paper. I've just got this one that's 80 GSM. So to start off with my first piece here, I'm taking a slick of glue pen and I'm going to put it on the reverse of this triangle, just a little bit here. Then I'm going to take my first piece of fabric. This one is going to go right sides facing uppermost, and I'm going to place that evenly on the top of section number 1. So when I turn it over, I can see here that it's extending beyond on all 3 sides. Then what I'm going to do is we need to add piece number 2, which is this. Let me just iron this to get rid of those markings. We're then going to do triangle number 2, which is this one here. So we need one of our sky pieces, and that one has to be, will sit 1/4 inch around this piece number 2 here. So we're going to fold back along the line between 1 and 2, and I'm taking my add an 1/8 ruler because this has a beveled edge on it, but you could use something like a postcard. And I'm going to fold back along the line between 1 and 2. So I'm going to fold back. Now, if you're not using the pre-prepared squares, you may want to trim back your seam allowance using an add a 1/4 ruler or a standard acrylic ruler, just to remove any excess. You can use a standard acrylic ruler where you just place your 1/4 inch line against this fold, and then you can trim. The benefit of an add a 1/4 ruler is if you're doing more complex piecing, that little lip just allows you to place on top and sit nice and even without rocking about. Right, so we've trimmed off piece number 1. The piece number 2 that we're doing, I'm just tracing through from the wrong side. This is section number 2. So you've got 2 plus you've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance running down one side, rough 1/4 inch on this side, and of course this is your 1/4 inch on this side. So we'll take our next piece of fabric for number 2. If this were a print fabric, you would make sure that the print was facing uppermost, because you want this fabric and this one to be right sides together. As it's a solid, nice and easy, you don't have to think about it. So we're going to place these right sides together, making sure that this sits nice and evenly on that triangle of fabric underneath. And you can just see that these raw edges are matching, and there's fabric poking out from the underside of where this dotted line is and from where this dotted line. You know that you've got enough wiggle room. So from here, I take this across to my sewing machine. I just pick it up between my fingers, thumb and forefinger, and I take that over to the sewing machine. If you wanted to, you could just flip this fabric back and pop in a pin to secure. But when you get more confident with what you're doing, you'll find that you don't necessarily need to do that. So I'll pick it up and bring it across to the sewing machine. Here I have my straight stitch foot, and I have got, I'm using black thread today, and I've got my straight stitch plate on, which is one where it's got just a little hole here just to stop any fabric or anything being pulled into the machine. And I have got my stitch length set to 1.8, which is shorter than I would do normally for standard piecing. That just means that it's easier to remove the paper once you have finished sewing. So before I start, I'm just making sure that these raw edges are matching. I then slide open the paper template, and I'm going to slide that underneath the machine. I'm then going to start stitching just to this edge of the dotted line. So I'm going to sew through this outer seam allowance, along this straight line, up to this point where there's a line crossing it. I'm going to do a couple stitches over. So I'm just placing my needle in the down position, lowering my presser foot, stitching through the seam allowance and along that line. Now I'm getting to that line that was running across here, and I'm just doing a couple of stitches over and then cut my thread. So you can see here I've done a couple of stitches, I've gone through the seam allowance, along the line, and a couple of stitches just over this line that runs across. So to begin with, I'm going to press that flat because I like to set my seams, and then I'm going to pull the fabric back across perpendicular to the line of stitching and iron. Now you can use a seam roller if you prefer, but I like to use an iron, all personal preference, and allow that to cool a moment. We can then move on to piece number 3. So we've got 1, 2, just count as you go along. 1, 2, we're going to piece number 3. Piece number 3 is another piece of sky on the other side. So we're going to do the same process that we did before, but we're sewing along the line in the other direction. I'm going to place my postcard or my beveled edge along that line, fold the template back, creasing. And the couple of stitches that I did beyond the solid line before, you just need to carefully release from your paper. Then take your add a quarter ruler or your acrylic ruler and trim off, leaving just a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're then going to be adding fabric for piece number 3, which is a sky piece, which is black again. So I'll draw that in for you so that you can see through. So this is piece number 3. So you've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance here. You've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance here poking out, and then a 1/4 inch along here. So your next piece of fabric, again, if this were a print, you'd place that with the right side facing uppermost so that it sews to the right side of these fabrics. And place that on top, just making sure that it's nice and even. Possibly go a little bit further to the right. Okay. And then at the machine, just make sure that those raw edges are matching. Flip the template over, And this time I'm going to sew a couple of stitches before this line here. Then I'm going to go down this solid line and through the seam allowance at the other end. Starting with my needle in the down position, just to make sure I'm in the right place. Lower my presser foot. And then I'm sewing on the line, and then I'm going through the seam allowance here and cut my threads. I'll press that flat, then pull back. And allow that to cool. So we've got pieces 1, 2, 3. Next we're going on to piece number 4. So flipping that over, you can see that piece number 4 is another geese section. So we're going to take the ruler or card and fold back along this line. And I'm now going to just trim these seam allowances to 1/4 inch. If you are doing one of these on a smaller scale, I would suggest maybe trimming these back to 1/8 inch, but that's entirely up to you. But I find it on when they start to get really small, these units work with 1/8 inch rather than the 1/4. Okay, so we folded back along that line. I'll draw again through here so that you can see roughly. I say roughly because I've just drawn a really wonky line. Okay, so this is piece number 4. You've got your 1/4 inch on these two edges and your 1/4 inch along the top. Again, right side facing uppermost so that it's right sides facing with this. And we're going to place that template centrally on the top of that triangle. Okay. And now we're going to take that to the machine, making sure the raw edges are still matching, flipping over, and we're going to sew from one end to the other. Now I'm going to start a couple of stitches beyond the start of the line, and I'm going to finish a couple of stitches beyond the finish. I'm not going through the seam allowance at this point because I will do that on the next line of stitching. So just a couple of stitches. Distance, drop the needle, drop the presser foot, and stitch. So I've started a couple stitches before all the way along the line and a couple stitches at the end. Pressing flat, and we'll pull that back just gently, but making sure that I'm pulling perpendicular to the line of stitching. And then we're ready to move on to piece number 5. But you can see here, because I've stitched exactly on the line, you can see how beautiful this point is here. Really, really lovely. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, we're moving on to piece number 5. It's over here. Fold back along the line. I'll take my add 1/4 ruler or standard acrylic ruler and reduce this seam allowance to get rid of this extra bulk, because you don't want this little bit of extra fabric in your finished piece. Another time, filling this triangle in here so that you can see what I'm doing. This is piece number 5. 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think my writing and my dash lines are getting worse. So we need another sky piece. Right sides together, right side facing uppermost. Place the template on top of the fabric that you're adding. Right sides together. at the machine. I'm now going to stitch through, excuse my hands, all the way through this seam allowance. So I'm going to start back here through the seam allowance, follow that line on the straight line and a couple of stitches beyond. Needle down, press a foot down, couple stitches beyond. Okay, so through the seam allowance, along the line, couple stitches beyond this next line here. Press it flat, pull back perpendicular to the line of stitching. Allow it to cool. Right, piece number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now piece number 6 is next. Really important when you're working with more complex designs is to just get yourself into the habit of counting where you're up to, because you can miss those tiny pieces and they can make a difference. Right, so I'm going to fold back on this line. So we're going to do a couple of stitches beyond this line and then we're going to extend through this seam allowance here. Fold the template, take your ruler, reduce these seam allowances to get rid of those extra little bits that you don't want in your block. And then we're going to take the next sky piece and place that on top, right sides facing. Needle down, press the foot down, and then stitch along the line. And then through the seam allowance at the other end. Okay. So I've started a couple stitches before, along the line, and then through the seam allowance at this end. Okay, and then we continue on in this same fashion, adding the geese, then the 2 sky, the geese and the 2 sky, according, the number that you need to do depends on the length of the strip that you're doing. So I'll continue on with this. If you're new to foundation paper piecing, this whole process might feel a little bit strange at first. In patchwork and quilting, piecing is frequently as simple as sewing 2 pieces of fabric right sides together. With foundation paper piecing though, the addition of this foundation can somehow make things more complicated in your mind and you can feel like you're doing mental gymnastics. Great for keeping your brain active, but when you're first trying this technique, it can feel a bit much. Do keep with it though, as once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to create fantastic looking quilt blocks, even when working on a smaller scale. Just follow the process of folding back the foundation, trimming the seam allowance, adding the new piece of fabric, and then pressing. Making strips of flying geese like this is a great way of getting used to the technique and finding your rhythm. By repeating the same steps over and over, you can really solidify the steps in your head. If not, you can, of course, always come back to this tutorial. So for this last one here, we're adding the final piece, piece number 12. I'm just going to stitch through the seam allowance at this end and through the seam allowance at this end. So folding the paper back, As usual, trimming the seam allowances in the same way. Then adding my final triangle for the sky, right sides together. And then dropping the needle through the seam allowance at either end. So you can see each time that it's when you're joining these sky pieces that this is where you're sewing through the seam allowances on the outer edge. And when you're sewing the geese in place, you're only doing a couple of stitches into this seam allowance, because when you're folding this paper back, if you've sewn all the way out to these edges, it makes it more difficult and you're having to tear into your template, your paper, in order to fold back. So it's only when you're sewing these corner sky pieces in place that you're sewing through these seam allowances. So I'll give this last section a press. And now we are ready to trim this template up, because we've now added all 12 of the pieces of fabric. We can then now trim along these dotted lines. So for that, I get a relatively decent sized acrylic ruler so that I can place my hand on top of the template and the ruler to keep it all in place. And then I will use an old rotary blade. So I'll keep, when the main rotary blade gets dull from cutting fabric, I save those and I place them in an old handle. This one's I dropped on the floor and broke. So I keep this for trimming paper and foundation paper piece templates. So when I'm ready, I will take a 1/4 of an inch line of my ruler and I will place that on the solid line on the outside edge of my template. And that should mean that the outside edge of my acrylic ruler should sit nicely on top of the dashed line on the pattern piece. Place my hands nice and firmly on top and then trim off the excess. So that will leave a nice sharp edge. And I'll just work my way around. Now I have to place my rotary that way because when I dropped it, that's what I broke, is the safety catch. So I always just make sure that I place that facing away from me. It's not terribly safe, but I don't use it that often. So just working around and do this final edge, 1/4 of an inch line on that outer solid line on the template, and trim. So now we have one completed strip, a bit fluffy, one completed strip of Flying Geese units. These ones measure 4 inches across by 2 inches high. And as you can see, because we've used this foundation, we've got these really lovely straight lines. We've not worried about the bias edges, and we've got these lovely points at the top. And when you come to sew this into another project, you've got these 1/4 of an inch seam allowances on the outside, so that you can see here on each of these corner points on each of these triangles are, well, you can't see on the bottom one, but you can see each of those sit 1/4 of an inch in from the side, so that when you come to sew that in, you're going to get your second and third points are all going to be really lovely and sharp as well. So I hope this tutorial has been useful for you, and I hope it gives you the confidence to give foundation paper piecing a try next time you are making some Flying Geese units. If you're looking for FPP Flying Geese templates, I have these and other quilt block designs available as PDF downloads through my website and via my Etsy store. There are links to both in the description below. Check out the website for a great blog post that will help you prep your fabrics for making FPP Flying Geese. By using these calculations, you can cut squares and triangles just the right size for the Flying Geese units you're working with. This will make sewing as easy as possible and will reduce fabric wastage. If you want to avoid doing the maths, sign up for the newsletter using the form on the blog post to get a free printable cheat sheet. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video useful, I'd really appreciate a click on the thumbs up and even a click to subscribe to my channel. I have some really great videos on quilting basics, foundation paper piecing, and English paper piecing too. See you next time.